The startup is one of the most fun parts of Dynasty, but it's also probably the riskiest.
If you understand the guardrails, you literally cannot mess this up. All right, welcome back to the desk.
Welcome back, baby.
Today, we are going to do just a nice overview of how to do a startup draft, which may sound super basic, but can be helpful. One, if this is one of your first times doing a league or you're jumping into Dynasty, fantastic. Or two, I mean, heck, Camden's done like 4 different Dynasty leagues this year. So it's always nice to maybe have a little bit of a refresher or see how we would go about doing a startup draft and picking our brains a little bit on some strategy. So, Cam, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you here to get us started.
Yeah, appreciate it. I mean, the startup is something that basically everybody does, and a lot of times it's the first thing you ever do as a Dynasty player, and it can be kind of punishing to mess it up. But it's actually it's not that mysterious. We're going to go through what the goals of an actual startup draft are, our sort of principles for how we think about things like pick selection and trading inside the draft, and then at the end we'll walk through one of the startups that we just did a week ago and walk through at least the first 5 or 6 rounds and say this is who we took, and more importantly, this is why we took these guys or what we were thinking when we made these picks for these trades.
And going into these things, it's less about filling a roster. At least this is how I think about it. It's less about filling a roster in the sense of like, I need 2 quarterbacks, 2 tight ends, 4 running backs. It's about finding value, building an arsenal or a war chest in the off season before you go into the year and really get started. See, I know we've talked about this in previous videos. The fantasy football season, we think about it in kind of 3 pieces. You have your out of season pre NFL draft. After all the playoffs are done, the hype's kind of dying down. Nothing's really gotten started yet, but you're already thinking of next year because you see the abyss of, no sports in the near future. And then you have part 2, which is post NFL draft. Mel Kiper's come out of his cave and has also gone back into his cave. Mini camps are starting, training camp. We're like getting hyped up. And then 3 is in season. And in season, at the end of the day, is where all the action happens. Like, we can have all of these value positions, all of these metrics, everything that we think is going to happen in the off season. And until the rubber meets the road and that first snap happens, we don't really know. So it's about, in these startup drafts, taking a step back and saying, how can I build as much value as possible going into that season as possible, just to make sure you're ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you'll hear other Dynasty channels harp on this quite a bit. It shouldn't be a revelation that value is the number one thing that we shoot for in a startup. And for exactly the reasons you said. During most startup drafts, the season isn't going yet, so it doesn't matter at all what your roster construction ends up being. You just want to have as much in your arsenal that you can use to trade to either create your rebuild or your contending roster once August and September start to roll around.
And yeah, and to piggyback off what you're saying about value, one of the key things in value is knowing the different tiers of the fantasy football draft. You have your S tier, that's going to be your Josh Allen's, Drake Mays, Jamar Chase's, those guys, all the way down the list. And so before entering a draft, it's important to have a good idea of those market tiers. Not saying go make your own market tier, because a lot of people with a lot more time on their hands than we do go ahead and do that for us. But it's nice to have an idea of like, what is Keep Trades Cut market tier? What is Fantasy Pros tier? Yahoo, right? Like everybody has them and they're all very similar. But knowing what players fall in what tier. And the reason being is because when you get to that draft, you can play a dangerous game sometimes to say, I'm going to take A.J. Brown in the 6th round. That's what I want to do. And by golly, I will trade the world to go get A.J. Brown. It could work for you. A.J. Brown could have a great year. But the point of the tier is you have all sorts of players in this one section.
And quite frankly, any of them should be relatively the same in terms of fantasy output. So it's nice having guys, nice having players, but know the tiers and know how to operate within those tiers is very important.
Yeah, and if you map those tiers out onto the draft board before the draft even starts, then you'll be in a great position to know which picks you might want to shop, which parts of the draft board you would like to move into or avoid, right? It's a real advantage understanding, okay, we're hitting the end of a tier and trading into this kind of a spot is going to give me a value win relative to just 2 picks down the road or vice versa.
Mm.
You can also adjust these for your league settings. Most of what's going on with Keep Trade Cut, Flock, Daddy, wherever you get your rankings from, is some sort of 12 team, super flex, small tight end premium baseline.
So that brings us to principle 1, and that is if there is somebody left in a higher tier, you take them or you trade out of it, but don't drop down to a lower tier and take a lower player when it's your turn to pick.
So that's something that pretty much all Dynasty channels will tell you. If there's somebody left that's a value faller or the last guy in a value tier, you should take them because that maximizes the value on your roster. But a lot of times you end up somewhere where there are multiple players available in the tier to pick from. Let's say you're at pick 2 in a startup. Well, there's 5 or 6 guys that you could reasonably take that are all the sort of same value. So then what do you do? Well, our second principle that we look at is the concept of liquidity. And this is basically the idea that some players are harder to trade than others.
Mm-hmm.
And this changes based on your league settings, based on the roster construction for your league. It changes based on whether you're at the top of the draft or closer to the bottom. We'll talk when we go through the examples of the startup about specific decisions that we made regarding liquidity and how that differed in round 1 and round 2 from, let's say, round 6 and round 7. But in general, if you have the ability to choose between multiple players, and one of them is very easy to trade, one of them is very hard to trade, we recommend in a startup getting the guy that is easier to do deals with because it gives you flexibility later on to pivot in whatever direction you want to. If you want to become a contender, you can take this rebuilding piece and flip it, or vice versa. Whereas if you get a guy that no one else really wants, then you're kind of stuck with them. Now, again, if they're the last guy in the value tier, you take them, even if they're not liquid. But if you have the choice between multiple guys, we like taking the ones that are easier to move. The other idea here is if you're in the middle, at the top or in the middle of a value tier, and you can trade back somewhere else in the same tier, feel free to do it, even if it's just for a small piece. If you're at pick 2 and somebody at pick 6 says, I have to have Jahmyr Gibbs.
Mhm.
Okay. Take an 8th round pick off their hands and let them move up a few spots and get their guy. It should be you should be agnostic as to whether you're getting person A, person B, person C
Mhm.
in the same tier. Works for me.
That brings us to principle number 3, arguably the most important one. You do you. What do we mean by that? We mean we've talked about liquidity, we've talked about value tier, we've talked about all these things. These are guardrails. These are the bumpers at a bowling alley. At the end of the day, as long as you're picking within a value tier, do it. Take the guy you want. Take the my guy. Take the flyer. Take the guy who's been on your team the last, 3 years in different fantasy football situations and you freaking love him. Take the Washington Commander if you're a Commanders fan, right? We're giving you basic principles on how to build a solid fantasy football team. And that really just means stay within the value tier. Take the guys you want to take.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a filter, right? It doesn't mean that because somebody's ranked 74 on Keep Trade Cut and the other guy's ranked 76 that, you can't drop down 2 picks. If you're staying within a value tier, get your guy. So now we'll walk through an example startup that we just did a couple weeks ago this summer. It was a derby style pick, which means, each player doesn't get assigned a random draft position. Instead, you get to pick your draft spot sort of in order. So we were towards the bottom end of the Derby, not at the very bottom. Thankfully, we had 3 spots available to pick from, which was spot 3, spot 8, and spot 10, if I remember. And so the first thing we did, just like we said, we mapped out our value tiers onto the draft board. And we saw that at pick 3, it meant that we were going to get one of our sort of cornerstone premium guys and then still get guaranteed a cornerstone on the way back. Whereas the other 2 positions would have been 2 of the sort of lower end cornerstones for us. And so we said, all right, let's take pick 3 and we'll see what falls to us there.
Yep. And what ended up happening is picks 1 and 2 were actually running backs, Bijan and Jameer. So that left us with 3 stud wide receiver options, Chase, JSN, Puka, or 2 elite quarterbacks, Allen and May.
Yep.
So how we went about analyzing this is we said, all right, what are we looking at on the way back in that next round pick? And there was a higher probability that second round pick for us was also going to land in a quarterback spot, just based off of the value tiers and how they're falling. So we said, okay, we're happy with any of these players, but in terms of liquidity and being able to move these guys down the road, let's not lock ourselves into 2 quarterbacks early. Let's take one of these 3 wide receivers. Quite frankly, I think any of these 3 would have been fine. We ended up going with JSN. But if it would have been Puka, if it would have been Chase, I don't think either. I mean, no complaints there.
Yeah, exactly. And with how the board fell, it would have been fine for us to go Allen or May as well. We just didn't know that going in, right? Because we knew we're going to be the very last person in this second tier.
Yeah.
So if it's Joe Burrow, if it's Malik Neighbors, if it's Devon Achane, if it's Drake London, we don't care who it is and we don't get to pick. So I don't like the 2 elite quarterbacks start this year. I think the running backs and wide receivers at the very high end, in the cornerstone range at least, are more liquid.
Yep.
So that's what we did in round 1. We got JSN, and then it turned out that the board fell to us for CeeDee Lamb at pick 2, and we were totally happy to get CeeDee there. I was actually a little over the moon. I didn't think there was much of a chance that he would be the follower.
People seem down on CeeDee this year. Hey, we were able to steal him in a couple of drafts.
Yeah. So those were the first 2 picks. And then we came down to round 3 and we got really lucky. So round 3, I think, has sort of a tier break in the middle where once you get past Tate, Patrick Mahomes, that sort of group, there's kind of a break. And then you're in the Chris Olave, Lad McConkey, Emeka Egbuka, Nico, Brock Purdy, Jonathan Taylor, all these guys, which are still really quality players, but I think they're a value shift below like Jackson Dart and Tet. But we actually got Carnell Tate to fall all the way down. So again, that was just an instant pick. No questions at all.
And leaving us with 2 very young receivers. Clearly Tate coming into his rookie year, who knows? JSN coming off a career year, and then CeeDee, who is probably at his peak in value this year, maybe next year, and then he'll start to fall. So we have a lot of room now from a receiver standpoint to either stick with it as the year goes on, or if our team's not shaping up how we expect it to, we have the ability to move some guys and should get a very solid return. So,
and notice that we didn't feel pressured after we took CeeDee to be like, we have to take in contending asset in round 3. Nope. The value faller comes to us at Tate and we say, boom.
Yeah. We also didn't look and say we have 2 wide receivers. Can't take a third receiver early. No. Value's there. Take the value. We can always trade and move the value if we need to. All right. And that brings us to round 4. And this is where we actually made the first trade of our draft. After going into it thinking in the first 3 rounds, wow, we really haven't been that active. We get to round 4. The reason we traded out of round 4, so we traded our 4th round pick for a early 7th round pick and a 2027 first round pick. Reason being is where our 4th and 5th round picks aligned, it happened to be in the same value tier. And when we were mapping things out at the beginning, we noticed a pretty significant drop off between like right around the mid third round pick, like Cam was saying a minute ago, around that kind of Mahomes area. And so we said, well, instead of kind of taking two guys in the same tier in the fourth and the fifth, let's pick up some future value with that 2027 first round pick. Also a very liquid pick with how that draft class is kind of shaping up to be. So that was the move in the fourth. And then in the fifth, I believe we took Price. Is that correct?
Yep, we just stuck and picked and called our shot with a guy that we think is going to be nice and liquid.
Yeah.
First round rookie running back tends to be a desirable asset.
Yeah. And stepping into a really favorable situation.
Absolutely. And then when we looked at the sixth and seventh, the last sort of tier break for us that we really care about is somewhere around the early to mid seventh round. I sort of see everything after that sort of going on a very gradual decline. The eighth round picks don't feel that different to me than the 12th round picks, and those don't feel that different than the 15th round picks. But there is sort of a confidence gap, right, as you're hitting Travis Etienne, Javonte Williams, Josh Jacobs, if he plays, where people are still super confident about these guys, and they tend to go right in the mid seventh. So we noticed that our early sixth was going to pair with a late seventh, and there was somebody that was interested in moving up. And so we said, that's fine. We'll slide back to the end of the sixth and get an early seventh. And that ended up working out great for us. We ended up getting Bucky Irving, Jared Goff, and Travis Etienne with those three picks sort of at the 6-7 turn. And that to me is sort of the dream. As soon as you pass that, you're getting into the sort of Jordan Addison, Bashal Tutin. And it's not that I necessarily hate all the players in this range. I think there's significantly more question marks.
Yeah.
So again, we're playing our own tiers. If you make different tiers, you may make different decisions. But for us, we got to slide back and collect as many picks as we could within the tier that we liked.
So basically, we're not going to go through the entire draft. We're at that point where the tiers continue to kind of drop off. But there was one more point that we did want to touch on when it comes to liquidity. And that is how liquidity changes or how we look at it as the draft progresses. And there's three tiers to it. So when we think about liquidity in your first, second, maybe third round picks, we like to look at it as a who is going to be easy to move and dynamic for the next few years. Those are typically your younger wide receivers and your younger running backs. So those guys who are max 26, but at 24, 25, 26 range, entering the primes of their careers. And for the next foreseeable future, we're talking 3, 4, 5 years, should be at the top of their game. If anybody, put those guys on the block, they're getting a hefty return. So that's your liquidity in those first few rounds, especially round 1, but round 1, 2, and 3. Then it kind of starts to shift. And Cam, you explain that middle tier for us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the middle of drafts, I think, has pretty high liquidity for almost all the players. If I'm imagining Emeka Egbuka, Trevor Lawrence, Brock Purdy, Jadarian Price, Judkins, even guys like McCaffrey, Saquon, pretty much that whole range from about round 3.5 down to that mid 7th round has players that are desirable for almost any roster, or that you could easily take on and then flip to another player. You feel like you can get deals done with a lot of these guys. Where it shifts for me again is once you're past that sort of mid 7th and the confidence starts to drop. I like to be more divergent in this range. So I would rather either have guys like DeAndre Swift and Michael Pittman and Devontae Adams, Derrick Henry, guys that could spike and be really desirable for contenders where if a team is contending, they will want this guy. Or the opposite direction, picks, Travis Hunter, Jaden Higgins, new rookies, players that are going to be desirable for rebuilding teams. I tend to avoid the Wan'Dale Robinson, Jordan Addison kind of range of player where they're in between. They technically hold the same value as the other
Yeah.
guys in the range. It's just that there's not going to be anybody banging down the door that's like, I have to have
Addison.
Malik Willis,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, like it's just, oh yeah, Malik. Congrats
Malik.
to Malik's agent. So yeah, that's the way I see it. And then at the top of the range, if I did end up at the back of the draft at like, let's say pick 110, 111, 112, I really like in particular the Malik Neighbors, Genty, Jordan Love group. I think that group of players is just desirable for every roster.
Yeah.
I will take the CeeDee Lambs, the Justin Jeffersons, the Amon-Ra St. Brown group, but I feel like they're sort of assets that are going to depreciate. They're going to score, but they're going to depreciate. And so only really contenders want to buy them.
Mm.
And then quarterbacks and tight ends, especially out of a startup, are just really hard to sell in those first 2 rounds.
Yes.
Once you get to the Purdy, Darts, Trevor Lawrence, all the way down to like Kyler and Bryce Young and all those guys, pretty mobile, are pretty easy to move around. But those high-end quarterbacks coming out of a startup, like you just can't sell them. Every time that I've come out of a startup with a
Yep.
Lamar or a Burrow or a Jaden Daniels, you're stuck with them. And it's cool to have one and be stuck with scoring 25 points. But from a flexibility perspective, I think it's a little more limiting than having the wide receivers and running backs.
Yeah, and,
So-
and it's not saying that Joe Burrow is not a valuable player. It's the return that somebody's willing to give you for Joe Burrow isn't going to be what you think Joe Burrow is worth.
Yeah, it's just going to be harder to move.
Yep. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you don't mind, like and subscribe below.
And if you want a free roster review, check out the Google form in the description. Your team could be featured in one of our videos. See you in the next one.